I was scraping frozen slush off my driveway at 5 in the morning when I first realized my life in Pleasant Valley Estates was about to become a bureaucratic nightmare. The amber strobes on my snowplow reflected off the pristine white snow, casting dancing shadows across my neighbor's windows. I had just finished my second pass when I saw the police cruiser pull into my driveway, its red and blue lights adding to the light show. Officer Martinez stepped out of his vehicle, looking tired and slightly annoyed. I killed the engine on my truck and hopped down, my boots crunching in the fresh snow. "Morning, officer," I said, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "Everything all right? Got a call about unauthorized emergency vehicle lights," he said, nodding toward my truck. "Someone reported you for impersonating emergency services." I blinked at him, genuinely confused. "My snowplow lights. These are standard safety strobes. They're required equipment in Massachusetts." The officer walked around my truck, examining the amber strobes mounted on the cab. "These look like standard commercial plow lights to me. Who called this in?" "I can guess," I muttered. "My HOA president has been on my case about everything since I moved here last fall." Officer Martinez pulled out his notepad. "Name's Isaac Norton, right? You're the guy who runs the landscaping company." "That's me. Norton's Landscaping and Snow Removal. I've been plowing driveways in this area for 8 years, lived here for 6 months." He sighed and closed his notebook. "Look, Mr. Norton, these lights are clearly legal. They're amber, not red or blue, and you're operating commercial snow removal equipment. But I had to respond to the call. Do you know who specifically made the complaint?" "I'd bet my truck it was Deborah Whitmore. She's the HOA president and she's had it out for me since day one." The officer nodded slowly. "I'm familiar with Mrs. Whitmore. She calls us pretty regularly about various issues in the neighborhood." The way he said it made it clear this wasn't the first frivolous call from her. "You're all set here. Just keep doing what you're doing. Those lights are perfectly legal and actually required for what you're doing." I watched him drive away, then looked across the street where I could see a curtain quickly fall back into place in Deborah's front window. This wasn't going to be the end of it. I knew her type. She was the kind of person who couldn't stand being wrong, and she definitely couldn't stand being contradicted by the police. I climbed back into my truck and finished clearing my driveway, then started on my elderly neighbor's property. Mrs. Chen was 83 and could barely walk, let alone shovel snow. I'd been clearing her driveway for free since I moved in, and it was the least I could do for someone who always had fresh cookies ready when I knocked on her door. The sun was starting to rise by the time I finished, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of pink and gold. I was just putting my equipment away in my garage when my phone buzzed. It was an email from the Pleasant Valley Estates HOA, sent at exactly 7 in the morning. "Dear Mr. Norton," it began, and I could practically hear Deborah's sanctimonious tone through the screen. "It has come to our attention that you are operating commercial equipment with unauthorized lighting within our community. Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws clearly states that no commercial vehicles may be parked or operated within the community between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. Additionally, the use of flashing lights of any kind is considered a disturbance to other residents. You are hereby notified that you must cease this activity immediately or face fines of $500 per violation. Sincerely, Deborah Whitmore, HOA President." I read the email 3 times, my coffee growing cold in my hand. This was insane. I lived here. My truck was registered at this address. I wasn't running a business out of my garage, I was just clearing snow. And the lights. They were legally required safety equipment. I called my lawyer, Tom Richardson, who had kept on retainer since starting my business. He answered on the third ring, sounding groggy. "Tom, it's Isaac. Sorry to call so early, but I've got an HOA problem." "Don't you always?" he said, and I could hear him moving around, probably making his own coffee. "What is it this time?" I explained the situation, reading him the email word for word. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. "Isaac, this is actually pretty cut and dry. Under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 85, Section 2, any vehicle engaged in snow removal operations must display amber warning lights visible from 500 feet. It's not optional. It's mandatory. And as for the commercial vehicle restrictions, you're not operating a business, you're maintaining your property. Even if you were plowing other driveways for money, which you're not, you'd still be within your rights as long as you're a resident." "So what do I do?" Respond to the email. "Cite the statute. I'll draft something for you. But Isaac, be prepared for this to escalate. HOAs don't like being told they're wrong." He wasn't kidding. By noon, I had a formal response from Tom citing all the relevant statutes and politely, but firmly informing the HOA that I would continue to operate my snow removal equipment as required by state law. I sent it off and went about my day, heading out to clear the parking lots for my commercial clients. When I got home that evening, there was a certified letter taped to my front door. The HOA was fining me $500 for the violation that morning and an additional $500 for willful disregard of community standards. They also informed me that a hearing would be held in 3 days to discuss my pattern of violations. Pattern of violations. I'd lived here for 6 months, and this was literally the first complaint. I called Tom again. "They're doubling down," he said after I read him the letter. "This is actually good for us. The more aggressive they get, the worse they look if this goes to court. Show up to the hearing, bring copies of the state law, and stay calm. Don't let them bait you into losing your temper." The next 3 days were tense. Every morning, I went out at 5 a.m. to clear my driveway with my strobes flashing. Every morning, I saw Deborah's curtains twitch. On the second morning, another police car showed up. This time it was Officer Kim, and she looked even less impressed with the call than Martinez had been. "Mr. Norton, I understand Mrs. Whitmore has called us about your plow lights again." "Second time this week," I confirmed. "I'm going to be honest with you. We've been instructed to respond to all calls, but this is clearly not a violation. Your lights are legal, required safety equipment. If she calls again, we'll still have to come out, but I want you to know that we're documenting these calls as unfounded." "Appreciate that, officer." She paused before getting back in her car. "Between you and me, Mrs. Whitmore has called us 47 times in the past year. Everything from suspicious vehicles that turned out to be visiting family members to noise complaints about kids playing basketball at 3 in the afternoon. You might want to document everything, just in case." Her words stuck with me. 47 calls in 1 year. That was almost once a week. I started keeping a detailed log of every interaction, every email, every time I saw her watching me from her window. The morning of the HOA hearing, another 6 inches of snow fell. I was out at 4:30 a.m., strobes blazing, clearing paths before most people woke up. By the time I finished, my phone had 3 missed calls from unknown numbers and 2 more emails from the HOA, each threatening additional fines. The hearing was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community center. I showed up 15 minutes early with Tom, carrying a folder full of printed statutes, photos of my truck with timestamps, and a list of every interaction I'd had with the HOA. The community center was a modest building near the entrance to Pleasant Valley Estates, with a meeting room that could hold maybe 50 people. When we walked in, Deborah was already there, sitting at a long table with two other board members. She was exactly what you'd picture: perfectly coiffed blonde hair, expensive athleisure wear, and an expression that suggested she'd just bitten into a lemon. "Mr. Norton," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How good of you to join us. And you brought your lawyer." "How very aggressive of you, Mrs. Whitmore," Tom said smoothly. "My client has the right to legal representation at any proceeding that could result in financial penalties." The other board members were Linda Prescott, the treasurer, and Gary Hughes, the secretary. Both looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with me. A handful of other residents filed in, curious about the drama. Deborah called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. "We're here tonight to address the violations committed by Mr. Isaac Norton of 247 Maple Drive. Mr. Norton has repeatedly violated HOA bylaws regarding commercial vehicle operation and disturbing light displays." "I'd like to address those charges," I said, standing up. "You'll have your turn to speak," Deborah snapped. "First, I'm going to present the evidence." She proceeded to show photos she'd taken from her window of my truck with the strobes on, time stamped at various early morning hours. She had screenshots of my business website. She even had a printout of my vehicle registration showing it was a 3/4-ton truck with a commercial snow plow attachment. "As you can see," she continued, "Mr. Norton is clearly running a commercial operation from a residential property, using industrial equipment with lights that disturb the peace and quiet of our community. This is exactly the kind of thing our bylaws were designed to prevent." When she finally sat down, looking smugly satisfied, Tom stood up. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. Now, if I may present the actual facts of this case." He opened his folder and pulled out several documents. "First, let's address the lights. Under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 85, Section 2, I quote, 'Every vehicle or combination of vehicles used for the removal of snow shall be equipped with amber flashing or rotating lights visible from a distance of 500 feet in all directions.' This isn't a suggestion. It's mandatory. My client isn't just allowed to use these lights, he's required by state law to use them." I watched Deborah's face turn red. "That's for commercial operators on public roads. The statute makes no such distinction," Tom continued calmly. "Any vehicle used for snow removal. Mr. Norton's driveway connects to a public road. He's legally required to have those lights active. Now, as for the commercial vehicle issue, Mr. Norton lives at this address. His vehicle is personally registered to him. He's not operating a business out of his garage. He owns a landscaping company with a separate commercial location. The fact that he uses his personal truck, which happens to be equipped for snow removal, to clear his own driveway is no different than any other resident using their own vehicle on their own property." Linda Prescott leaned forward. "But what about the bylaws regarding commercial vehicles?" "I'm glad you asked," Tom said, pulling out another document. "The bylaws state that commercial vehicles may not be parked overnight in the community. Mr. Norton's truck is parked in his garage. The bylaws also state that commercial operations may not be conducted from residential properties. Mr. Norton isn't conducting business. He's maintaining his property. Unless you're prepared to fine every resident who mows their own lawn with a commercial-grade mower or plows their own driveway with professional equipment, you have no grounds for this complaint." Gary Hughes cleared his throat. "I actually think Mr. Richardson has a point. I read through the bylaws again before tonight, and I'm not sure we have the authority to restrict what kind of vehicle a resident can own or what safety equipment they're required to use by state law." Deborah shot him a look that could have melted the snow outside. We have the authority to maintain community standards. Not when those standards contradict state law, Tom said firmly. Mrs. Whitmore, if you persist in fining my client for complying with mandatory safety regulations, we'll have no choice but to file a complaint with the State Attorney General's office and pursue legal action against the HOA for harassment. The room went silent. A few residents whispered to each other. I could see Linda and Gary exchanging worried glances. Furthermore, Tom continued, we're prepared to provide documentation showing a pattern of harassment against Mr. Norton, including multiple frivolous police calls, threatening correspondence, and attempts to levy baseless fines. We'd prefer to resolve this amicably, but we're prepared to take this as far as necessary. Deborah's face was now bright red, her hands gripping the table. This is outrageous. You can't just come in here and threaten this board. I'm not threatening anyone, Tom said calmly. I'm informing you of the legal reality of the situation. My client has done nothing wrong. Your attempts to fine him are not only baseless but potentially constitute harassment under state law. Linda raised her hand tentatively. Maybe we should table this discussion and consult with the HOA's attorney. We don't need an attorney, Deborah insisted. This is clearly a violation. Actually, Gary said, his voice getting stronger, I move that we dismiss all fines against Mr. Norton and formally recognize that state-mandated safety equipment is exempt from any HOA restrictions. Second, Linda said immediately. Deborah looked at them both with fury. You can't be serious. I call for a vote, Gary said. This is completely inappropriate, Deborah sputtered. All in favor of dismissing the fines and recognizing the exemption. Gary continued, ignoring her. Both he and Linda raised their hands. Deborah sat with her arms crossed, refusing to vote. Motion carries, 2-0 with 1 abstention, Gary announced. Mr. Norton, you're free to go. We apologize for this misunderstanding. I stood up, relief flooding through me. Thank you both for being reasonable about this. As Tom and I gathered our papers, Deborah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This isn't over, she said, directing her words at me specifically. I will find something. There's always something. Tom turned to her, his expression serious. Mrs. Whitmore, I strongly advise you not to make statements like that in front of witnesses. It could be construed as a threat of continued harassment. She stormed out of the room without another word. Several residents came up to me afterward, apologizing for the situation and thanking me for clearing Mrs. Chen's driveway. Apparently, I wasn't the only person Deborah had been targeting. She tried to fine the Johnsons for painting their front door navy blue instead of black, one woman told me. Said it wasn't an approved color, even though navy blue was specifically listed in the bylaws. She reported my husband for parking his work van on the street while he unloaded tools, another man said. Called it an abandoned vehicle even though he was standing right there. The stories kept coming, and a picture emerged of someone who used the HOA as a personal fiefdom, wielding bylaws like weapons against anyone who annoyed her. Over the next few days, things seemed to settle down. I continued my morning snow removal routine without any police visits or threatening emails. I actually started to think the whole thing was behind me. Then the lawsuit arrived. Deborah Whitmore was suing me personally for creating a hostile living environment, harassment, and causing her emotional distress. The filing claimed that my early morning snow removal was deliberately designed to disturb her sleep, that the strobes were aimed at her windows to intimidate her, and that I'd engaged in a pattern of aggressive behavior toward her. I sat in Tom's office, reading through the complaint with growing disbelief. This is insane. I've barely spoken to her, Every interaction has been her coming after me. This is what we call a slap suit, Tom explained. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's designed to intimidate you, drain your resources, and force you to stop doing something you have every right to do. The good news is that Massachusetts has strong anti-slap laws. We can file a motion to dismiss and potentially recover our legal fees. How long will this take? A few months, probably. But Isaac, you need to understand something. This woman isn't going to stop. Even if we beat this lawsuit, she'll find something else. People like her see any challenge to their authority as a personal attack. He was right. 2 weeks later, I received a citation from the town building inspector claiming I was running an illegal business from my residence. When the inspector actually came out, he took one look around, saw that I had no commercial equipment stored on the property beyond my personal truck, no employees coming and going, and no business operations being conducted, and apologized for wasting both our time. "Let me guess," he said. "Deborah Whitmore called this in. How'd you know?" "Because she calls us about someone in your neighborhood at least once a month. Last month it was a guy who had his boat in his driveway for 3 days while he fixed the motor. She claimed he was running an illegal marina." He shook his head. "Look, I have to respond to every call, but I'm documenting all of this. If she keeps filing false reports, she could face charges for misusing town services." The lawsuit dragged on through February and into March. Tom filed our motion to dismiss under the anti-slap statute, and we waited for a hearing date. In the meantime, life in Pleasant Valley Estates had become increasingly uncomfortable. Deborah would glare at me whenever we crossed paths. She'd started a campaign to get other residents to file complaints against me, but from what I could tell, most people thought she was being ridiculous. Then something interesting happened. In early March, I got a call from Gary Hughes. "Mr. Norton, this is Gary from the HOA board. I was wondering if we could meet for coffee. There's something I need to discuss with you." We met at a local diner the next morning. Gary looked nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder like he was afraid of being caught. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said once we'd ordered. "Linda and I want to remove Deborah from the board, but we need cause. We've been documenting everything since your hearing, and we've discovered some concerning irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" "Financial ones. She's been approving expenses without board votes, paying her nephew's landscaping company double the market rate for services. And there are several $1,000s in HOA funds that we can't account for. We've hired a forensic accountant, and we're planning to present the findings at the next board meeting. But we wanted you to know because Deborah is likely to lash out when this happens, and you're her favorite target." "Appreciate the heads up," I said. "Is there anything I can do?" "Just be ready, and maybe attend the next board meeting. We might need witnesses." The board meeting was scheduled for March 15th. Our anti-slap hearing was set for March 20th. It was going to be an interesting week. On the evening of March 15th, the community center was packed. Word had gotten out about the financial investigation, and it seemed like half the neighborhood wanted to see what would happen. I sat in the back with Tom, who'd insisted on coming along. Gary called the meeting to order, and the tension in the room was palpable. Deborah sat at the board table, her expression icy and controlled. "Before we begin regular business," Gary said, "Linda and I have called a special session to address serious concerns about financial management of HOA funds. We've hired an independent forensic accountant to review the books for the past 2 years. Mr. Patterson, would you please present your findings?" A middle-aged man in a suit stood up and walked to the front. He opened a laptop and pulled up a presentation on the screen. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've completed a comprehensive audit of the Pleasant Valley Estates HOA finances. My findings are deeply concerning. Over the past 18 months, approximately $47,000 in HOA funds have been misappropriated or spent without proper board approval. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Deborah remained stone-faced. Mr. Patterson continued, clicking through slides showing various transactions. Payments to Whitmore Landscaping, a company owned by Mrs. Whitmore's nephew. Total $18,000 for services that were either never performed or billed at 3 times the market rate. Additionally, there are numerous cash withdrawals totaling $22,000, all approved solely by Mrs. Whitmore without board votes or documentation of how the funds were used. There are also several purchases made on the HOA credit card that appear to be personal in nature, including furniture, clothing, and dining expenses, totaling approximately $7,000. Deborah suddenly stood up. "This is a witch hunt. You're all conspiring against me because I dare to maintain standards in this community." "Deborah," Linda said firmly, "these are documented financial transactions. We need answers." "I don't have to answer to any of you," Deborah snapped. "I've given 2 years of my life to this community, and this is the thanks I get. Being accused of theft by some accountant you hired to frame me." "Nobody's framing anyone," Gary said. "We're following proper procedure. These irregularities were discovered during a routine audit." "There's nothing routine about this," Deborah shot back. She pointed at me. "This is all because of him. He comes in here with his lawyer, challenging everything, and now you're all turning on me." "Mrs. Whitmore," Tom stood up, "I've had no involvement in the HOA's financial audit. This has nothing to do with my client." "Liar, you're all liars." Deborah grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "I quit. You people deserve what you get." "Deborah, wait," Gary called out. "We need to discuss this properly. There are legal implications." But she was gone, the door slamming behind her. The room descended into chaos, everyone talking at once. Gary banged the gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. "Please, everyone, quiet down. Mr. Patterson, in your professional opinion, is this matter serious enough to warrant law enforcement involvement?" Mr. Patterson nodded gravely. "Given the amounts involved and the apparent intent to conceal the transactions, yes. This appears to be embezzlement." "Then I move that we turn these findings over to the police and the district attorney's office," Linda said. The motion passed unanimously from the remaining board members. As people filed out of the meeting, discussing the shocking revelations, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. I hadn't wanted any of this. I just wanted to clear my driveway in peace. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. The police opened an investigation into Deborah's handling of HOA funds. On March 20th, Tom and I appeared in court for our anti-SLAPP hearing. Deborah didn't show up. Her lawyer made a half-hearted argument that the lawsuit had merit, but the judge wasn't having it. "Counselor," the judge said, peering over her glasses, "your client sued Mr. Norton for using legally mandated safety equipment on his own property. She claimed emotional distress because he was plowing snow at 5 in the morning during a snowstorm. Unless you have some compelling argument I'm missing, this appears to be a textbook SLAPP suit." The lawyer shuffled some papers. "Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore genuinely believes Mr. Norton has been targeting her. Beliefs are not evidence. Motion to dismiss is granted. Furthermore, I'm awarding attorney's fees and costs to Mr. Norton in the amount of—" She glanced at the paperwork. $12,500. Mrs. Whitmore will have 30 days to pay. Next case. We walked out of the courthouse into bright spring sunshine. The snow had finally melted, revealing the brown grass beneath. "It's over," I said, hardly believing it. "This part is," Tom agreed, "but the criminal investigation is just beginning. You might be called as a witness when they charge her with embezzlement." He was right. In mid-April, Deborah Whitmore was formally charged with embezzlement, theft, and fraud. The investigation had uncovered even more irregularities, bringing the total misappropriated amount to over $60,000. She'd been using HOA funds as her personal bank account for years. The preliminary hearing was in May. I was called to testify about her pattern of harassment and her behavior at the board meetings I'd attended. It wasn't pleasant. Deborah sat at the defense table, looking much older and more tired than she had just 2 months ago. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a dedicated volunteer who'd made some accounting mistakes, but the evidence was overwhelming. In June, she pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for making full restitution and serving 18 months in jail. She'd also been ordered to pay my legal fees from the dismissed lawsuit, which she did through her lawyer without a word. Pleasant Valley Estates slowly returned to normal. Gary was elected the new HOA president, and one of his first acts was to revise the bylaws to require more financial oversight and transparency. He also removed most of the petty restrictions that Deborah had been so fond of enforcing. "We're supposed to be helping people maintain their homes and build community," Gary said at a neighborhood barbecue in July, "not acting like property dictators." Mrs. Chen made it through the winter just fine, and I continued clearing her driveway whenever it snowed. Several other elderly residents asked if I'd do the same for them, and I was happy to help. It became a neighborhood thing. On snow days, those of us with plows would divide up the driveways of residents who needed help, working together to make sure everyone could get out safely. The police stopped getting calls from our neighborhood, at least the frivolous ones. Officer Martinez told me that the change was noticeable at the station. "We used to groan whenever we saw an address from Pleasant Valley Estates come up," he admitted. "Now you guys are like any other neighborhood. The occasional actual problem, but nothing crazy." My business thrived that year. Word got out about the HOA situation, and several other communities reached out asking if I'd take them on as clients. Apparently, standing up to an abusive HOA president was good marketing. Who knew? In August, I got a letter from Deborah's lawyer. Inside was a handwritten note from Deborah herself. It was short and awkward, clearly written because her lawyer had insisted. "Mr. Norton, I apologize for the trouble I caused you. I let my position go to my head and treated you unfairly. I hope you can forgive me someday. Deborah Whitmore." I showed it to Tom, who was helping me go through some business paperwork at my kitchen table. "What do you think?" I asked. He shrugged. "I think her lawyer made her write it, but maybe there's some genuine remorse in there somewhere. People do strange things when they get a little bit of power." "Should I respond?" "That's up to you. You don't owe her anything." I thought about it for a few days. Finally, I wrote a brief note back, sending it through her lawyer. "Mrs. Whitmore, I accept your apology. I hope you're able to move forward and learn from this experience. Isaac Norton." I didn't hear from her again. From what I understood, she served her time and moved to another state after her release. Her husband divorced her during the legal proceedings, and they sold their house in Pleasant Valley Estates. A nice young couple with twins bought it. They were friendly and normal, and I cleared their driveway all winter without a single complaint. The case became something of a local legend in HOA circles. Tom said he'd been contacted by several homeowners facing similar situations, all asking for advice on dealing with overreaching HOAs. He even wrote an article about it for a legal journal, using my case as an example of how HOA power can be abused and what legal remedies are available. As for me, I learned several valuable lessons. First, always know your rights and the laws that apply to your situation. If I hadn't had Tom's help understanding the Massachusetts statutes about snow removal equipment, I might have caved to Deborah's demands just to avoid conflict. Second, document everything. The records I kept of every interaction, every email, and every incident were crucial in showing the pattern of harassment. Third, stand up for yourself, but do it the right way. I never lost my temper, never retaliated, and never stooped to her level. I just insisted on my legal rights and let the system work. The whole experience also taught me something about community. Once Deborah was gone, Pleasant Valley Estates became a genuinely pleasant place to live. Neighbors looked out for each other. We had block parties and helped each other with projects. The HOA, under Gary's leadership, focused on actual community improvement instead of petty enforcement. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep in October, surrounded by family. At her funeral, her daughter thanked me for being such a good neighbor to her mother in her final years. "She talked about you all the time," her daughter said. "How you'd clear her driveway before she even woke up, how you'd check on her after storms, how you never made her feel like a burden. That meant the world to her and to us. That made all the HOA drama worthwhile. I wasn't just fighting for my right to use my snowplow strobes. I was fighting for my ability to be a good neighbor and help people who needed it." The following winter was busy but peaceful. Every time it snowed, I'd be out there at 5 in the morning, amber strobes flashing, clearing paths and making sure people could get to work or to the doctor, or wherever they needed to go. The lights that had caused so much trouble had become a welcome sight in the neighborhood, a signal that someone was looking out for everyone. One particularly brutal storm in January dropped almost 2 feet of snow overnight. I was out there for hours, working my way through the neighborhood. When I finally finished and got home, exhausted and frozen, I found a basket on my porch. Inside were homemade cookies, hot chocolate mix, and a card signed by 24 neighbors thanking me for my help. I sat in my warm kitchen, eating cookies and thinking about how differently things could have gone. If Deborah had just talked to me like a normal person when she first had concerns, if she'd listened when the police and my lawyer explained the law, if she'd chosen to build community instead of enforcing her personal vision of order, none of the ugliness would have happened. She'd still be living in her nice house, she wouldn't have a criminal record, and she wouldn't have destroyed her marriage and reputation. But that's the thing about power, even small power like being an HOA president. It reveals character. Some people use it to help others. Some people use it to control others. Deborah chose control, and it destroyed her life. Gary, on the other hand, used his position to make things better. He organized community events, facilitated communication between neighbors, and made sure the HOA served its actual purpose, maintaining common areas and protecting property values through reasonable, fair standards. Under his leadership, home values in Pleasant Valley Estates actually increased, and several real estate agents started specifically marketing the neighborhood as having a reasonable, resident-friendly HOA, which was apparently a big selling point. Spring came again, and with it, a full year since the whole mess had started. I was in my garage, doing some maintenance on my plow equipment and getting it ready for storage, when Gary stopped by. "Hey Isaac, got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" "The board wanted me to ask if you'd consider joining. We need to fill Linda's spot since she's moving to Florida to be near her grandkids." I paused, wrench in hand. "You want me on the HOA board, after everything that happened, especially after everything that happened. You stood up for what was right, even when it costs you time and money and stress. That's exactly the kind of person we need making decisions about this community. Plus, you actually understand state law and property rights, which would be useful. I thought about it. A year ago, I would have said no way, never, absolutely not. HOAs were nothing but trouble as far as I was concerned, but Gary and Linda and the other neighbors had shown me that it didn't have to be that way. Can I think about it? Take your time. Elections aren't until next month. I talked it over with Tom, with Mrs. Chen's daughter, with several of my neighbors. Everyone encouraged me to do it. Finally, I decided why not. If I wanted to make sure we never had another Deborah situation, the best way to do that was to be involved. I ran unopposed and was elected to the board in April. My first board meeting as a member was surreal. I sat at the same table where I'd been interrogated about my plow lights just over a year ago. But this time, we discussed normal things: approving funds for new playground equipment, organizing a neighborhood yard sale, reviewing proposals for repaving the community center parking lot. At the end of the meeting, Gary asked if anyone had new business. An older gentleman I didn't know well raised his hand. I wanted to bring up the Christmas lights situation. Several neighbors, including myself, would like to put up more elaborate displays this year, but I understand we have some restrictions. Could we review those? Here we go, I thought. This is exactly the kind of thing that could turn into another Deborah situation if we weren't careful. Gary looked at me. Isaac, you're good with regulations and statutes. What do you think? I think we should look at what the actual bylaws say. Consider any safety or electrical concerns, and then be as flexible as possible. If someone wants to turn their house into the North Pole, as long as it's not creating a hazard or seriously impacting their neighbors, why should we care? The older gentleman smiled. That sounds reasonable to me. Let's form a committee to review the current restrictions and make recommendations, Gary suggested. Anyone interested? Several hands went up, including mine. We'd meet next week and figure out something that made sense. That's how it worked now. Instead of top-down edicts from someone on a power trip, we had discussions, committees, and decisions made by consensus. It was slower sometimes, but it was fair, and people trusted the process. Over the next few years, Pleasant Valley Estates became known as one of the better-managed HOA communities in the area. We were featured in a local magazine article about effective community governance. Several other HOAs reached out asking for advice on how we'd turned things around. Gary always gave the same answer. We remembered that we're neighbors first and an HOA board second. Our job is to serve the community, not rule it. I served on the board for 3 years before deciding I'd rather focus on my business and my personal life. I'd met Rachel Newman, a teacher who'd moved into the neighborhood during all the drama with Deborah. We'd bonded over our shared experience of dealing with difficult situations in positions of limited power. She dealt with impossible parents. I dealt with an impossible HOA president. We got married in a ceremony at the community center, with half the neighborhood in attendance, on our wedding day, as Rachel and I danced our first dance as husband and wife. I looked around at all our neighbors celebrating with us. These people had started as strangers, became adversaries during the conflict with Deborah, and ended up as genuine friends and community. Mrs. Chen's daughter was there, along with Officer Martinez and his wife, Tom and his partner, Gary and Linda, who'd flown back from Florida for the wedding, and dozens of other people who'd become important parts of my life. "What are you thinking about?" Rachel asked, smiling up at me. Just how weird life is. A year and a half ago, I was being sued for using my snowplow lights. Now I'm married, surrounded by people I care about, in a community that actually feels like home. All because some HOA president couldn't stand the sight of amber strobes at 5 in the morning. Rachel laughed. Sometimes the worst things lead to the best outcomes. If Deborah hadn't been so awful, you might never have gotten involved in the community. You'd just be the guy who lived at the end of the street. She was right. The conflict had forced me to engage, to fight for my rights, and in doing so, to really become part of Pleasant Valley Estates. I'd made real connections with people, learned about my legal rights, discovered I had a talent for community organization, and met my wife. Still, I said, I could have done without the death threats and the lawsuit. Death threats? Rachel looked alarmed. Oh, didn't I mention those? Deborah left me a few voicemails during the worst of it. Tom reported them to the police, but they couldn't prove it was her. Isaac Norton, we've been together for over a year. How is this the first I'm hearing about death threats? I guess I forgot. It was a crazy time. She shook her head, but she was smiling. You are the most laid-back person I've ever met. Someone threatens your life and you forget about it. They weren't very creative threats. Mostly just you'll regret this type stuff. I was more worried about the lawsuit. The song ended, and we were immediately pulled into conversations with various guests. The party went late into the night, with speeches and toasts and more food than any reasonable number of people could eat. As things were winding down, Gary pulled me aside. I wanted you to know something. I ran into Deborah's ex-husband a few weeks ago. He said Deborah is doing better. She's in therapy, has a regular job, and is trying to make amends for everything that happened. That's good to hear, I said, and I meant it. I'd never wanted to ruin her life, just to stop her from ruining mine. He also said she's been diagnosed with a personality disorder. Something about needing control and validation. The therapist thinks the HOA presidency fed into her worst impulses, gave her a platform to exercise control without any real accountability. It made sense. Deborah hadn't been evil, just deeply troubled and in a position that allowed her issues to cause maximum damage. I hope she finds peace, I said. Me too. But I also hope she never joins an HOA board again. We both laughed at that. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after the wedding. I ran my business. Rachel taught her 5th graders, and we built a life together in Pleasant Valley Estates. Every winter, I'd still be out there at 5 in the morning when it snowed, amber strobes flashing, clearing driveways for the elderly and disabled neighbors who couldn't do it themselves. The lights that had once been the center of so much controversy became just another normal part of the neighborhood. Kids would get excited when they saw the strobes outside their windows, knowing it meant a snow day from school. Parents would relax, knowing they could get to work without digging out their cars first. The elderly residents could stay safe in their warm homes instead of risking falls on icy driveways. Those mandatory safety lights, the ones Deborah had hated so much, had become a symbol of community care and mutual support. It was funny how things worked out sometimes. 5 years after the whole mess started, I was serving on a panel at a national HOA management conference, sharing lessons learned from the Pleasant Valley Estates situation. The room was packed with board members and property managers from across the country, all wanting to know how to avoid similar disasters in their own communities. The key, I explained, is to remember that HOA rules exist to protect property values and promote community welfare. They don't exist to give board members power or to enforce personal preferences. When someone on your board starts using bylaws as weapons, that's a red flag. A woman in the audience raised her hand. But how do you stop it? Board members have a lot of discretion. Checks and balances, I said. Multiple board members who have to approve major decisions. Regular financial audits. term limits so no one person stays in power too long, and most importantly, community engagement. Residents need to pay attention to what their HOA is doing and speak up when something seems wrong. Another hand went up. What if the board member is following the letter of the law? What if they're technically right but being unreasonable? That's where judgment comes in. Just because you can enforce a rule doesn't mean you should. I remember a situation in our community where a family put up a basketball hoop that was technically 3 inches over the height limit in the bylaws. The old board president would have made them take it down. The new board looked at it, saw that it wasn't bothering anyone, wasn't a safety hazard, and voted to revise the height limit to accommodate normal recreational equipment. Sometimes the rules need to change, not the people. After the panel, several attendees approached me with their own horror stories. It seemed like almost every HOA had a Deborah, or had one in their past. People who confused authority with power, who used community rules to settle personal grievances, who made life miserable for their neighbors in the name of property standards. But I also heard stories of good HOAs, boards that really did improve their communities. Ones that organized neighborhood watches that reduced crime, that maintained beautiful common areas that increased property values, that facilitated connections between neighbors that made subdivisions feel like real communities. The difference, I realized, always came down to the people involved and their motivations. Were they there to serve or to rule? Flying home, I thought about how far Pleasant Valley Estates had come. We'd gone from a community terrorized by an abusive board president to one of the best-managed HOAs in the region. Property values had increased 20% over 5 years. Crime was down. Resident satisfaction surveys showed over 90% approval of the board's management, up from 38% before Deborah's removal. And it had all started with a simple disagreement about amber strobes on a snowplow. About legally mandated safety equipment that one person decided she didn't like. I thought about what might have happened if I'd just given in, if I'd stopped using my lights to avoid conflict. Mrs. Chen might have fallen on her icy driveway and broken a hip. Other elderly neighbors would have struggled to clear their own snow, risking heart attacks and injuries. And Deborah would have continued her reign of terror, finding new targets, embezzling more money, making more people miserable. Standing up to her had been hard. The lawsuit, the stress, the conflict with neighbors, the police visits, all of it had been exhausting and unpleasant. But it had been necessary, and ultimately, it had made things better not just for me, but for everyone in the community. Rachel picked me up from the airport, and we drove home through familiar streets. As we turned into Pleasant Valley Estates, I saw Mr. Thompson out walking his dog, Mrs. Rodriguez checking her mail, the Chen family's younger generation visiting the house that now belonged to them. Normal neighborhood scenes, the kind you see in any community. But I knew what it had taken to get here. The courage of Gary and Linda to stand up to Deborah's financial irregularities. The patience of Officer Martinez and his colleagues dealing with frivolous calls. Tom's skill in navigating the legal system. The forensic accountant who'd uncovered the embezzlement. The judge who'd seen through the slap suit. The district attorney who'd prosecuted the case. And dozens of neighbors who'd refused to let one person's dysfunction define their community. "Welcome home," Rachel said as we pulled into our driveway. Home. That's what it was now, truly. Not just a house in a subdivision, but a home in a community. A place where people looked out for each other, where reasonable rules were fairly enforced, where conflict was resolved through discussion and compromise rather than lawsuits and threats. All because I'd insisted on my right to use state-mandated safety equipment on my own property. It seemed like such a small thing, looking back. Amber strobes on a snowplow, but it had been the catalyst for massive change, for exposing corruption, for building real community. Sometimes the biggest battles start over the smallest things. That winter brought record snowfall. I was busier than ever, clearing commercial lots and residential driveways, my amber strobes flashing through the pre-dawn darkness storm after storm. But I always made time for the neighbors in Pleasant Valley estates who needed help. It wasn't just the right thing to do anymore. It was a joy, a way of contributing to a community I genuinely cared about. One morning, after a particularly brutal overnight storm, I finished clearing Mrs. Rodriguez's driveway and found her waiting with a thermos of coffee and a grateful smile. "You're a lifesaver, Isaac. I have to get to the hospital for my shift, and I never would have gotten out in time without you." Happy to help. That's what neighbors do. As I drove away, strobe still flashing, I saw her watching me go with an expression of genuine appreciation. That's what made it all worthwhile. Not the victory over Deborah, not the legal precedent we'd set, not even the improvements to the HOA governance. It was the connection, the community, the knowledge that we were all looking out for each other. That's what home really meant. And those controversial amber lights, the ones that had caused so much trouble, were now symbols of that mutual care and support. In the end, the story wasn't really about HOA overreach or legal battles or embezzlement, though all of those things had happened. It was about what happens when people decide to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. About how communities can heal from conflict and become stronger. About how the worst situations can sometimes lead to the best outcomes. And it was about snowplow lights, those mandatory safety strobes that had started it all, still flashing bright and amber in the winter darkness, keeping everyone safe and lighting the way home.